So when a user successfully gets created in the database, we actually need to sign them in. Right now, we're going to redirect them back to the home page, the root path, but we're not going to sign them in at all. And that is a problem. So the way to do this is actually to set a cookie to keep track of the user being signed in. Now we can access our cookies by saying cookies, and we can give a cookie a name and say user ID is whatever. But if we were to do that, that is going to be something anybody can do and change their user ID that they're logged in as. That would be very, very bad. So Rails provides two other options. You have session cookies and you have sign cookies. And so if we use the session, this is an encrypted store. So it gets stored as a cookie in your browser, but it's encrypted so nobody can read it or tamper with it. And that is what we want to use here. So we can say session user ID equals @user.id. And that is going to sign in the user. And this is something that can be set server side, but browsers can never tamper with that. So nobody can mess with this. And we can use that ID on the next request to check to see if the user is logged in. So we'll be able to use that from our main controller or our main index and print that out. So let's go open up our main controller and we will say if session user ID, then we can look up the user and say user.find and we'll give it the ID. So we want to say the same thing, session user ID. That is going to return us the number for the user in both of those cases. As long as the number is set and it's not nil, we can look the user up and then we can go into our main index and say if @user is present, we can print out @user.email. We need to use the equals there. And that will print out logged in as email address. So there we go. So let me show you how this whole process works. If we open the browser and we go to the application tab in our DevTools, we can go to cookies and look at the current site that we're on. You'll see that our Rails app has generated this scheduled tweets session. So this is generated automatically. It's empty by default, but you can see here there's nothing we can read inside of it. And that's good because we don't want to be able to mess with this. It's also marked as HTTP only, so JavaScript and stuff cannot access it. But cookies are a header that is sent back and forth always, every request in your browser. So that way that you can be logged in and every request you make later is going to automatically be logged in because this cookie is sent over with your requests. Now right now the cookie for our session is empty. There's nothing inside of it. There's no user ID. But if we were to create an account that works with a valid password, what just happened is that we made a request from the browser. We sent all of that information over in a post request. It tried to grab the user out of the params. It was successful getting that. So we found what we needed, no errors. Then we create a new user in memory and assign those email, password, and password confirmation. And all of that is done right here. So user.new grabs the user params, jumps down here, finds all of those out of the params, sends them back to user.new, which creates a new user with all those fields, so the email and password confirmation. But it's just in memory, and then we try to save it to our database. That runs the validations and then inserts it into our database. If that was successful, we tell our session, hey, we would like to add the user ID into the session as the database ID. Nobody can tamper with that, so it's safe, and we can just assign the ID there. Then we send you back to the home page, and we set that notice of successfully created account. And that is all that happens there. So then your browser gets the redirect, which is a 302 request or response. And then it says, okay, we will redirect there, and it will make a GET request to where you redirected to. So it loads that page again, and we see our home page now with that logged in user. And this comes from the main controller coming through and saying, hey, if there's a user ID in the session, let's look up the database user with that value and assign them to this instance variable. Then we'll go render the view, and the view will say, hey, looks like you set that variable, so we can print out their email address. And that is how it's all connected up. And if we were to go to this in incognito, we'll see that there is no user printed out here. And that's because we're not logged in this browser. In incognito, we have a separate session, and that session does not have a user ID inside of it. So the session is kind of an encrypted hash in Ruby that has anything you want to store in it. It needs to be simple stuff that can be serialized and set to the browser. But if we put the user ID in, we can look it up and log in the user automatically. So this is pretty cool. But what happens if we go to another terminal and we were on Rails console and we delete that user? So user.last.destroy, and we were previously logged in as user number 1. So our cookie, our session cookie, still has user number 1 in there, or number 3 actually. And if we delete that user, we're not going to be able to find them. So we're going to get an error. And that's because user.find will automatically throw an error when it can't find the record in the database. It's used for when we know for sure that should exist. So we can say find by instead and say, let's look for a record with the ID of that number, and find by will not throw an error when it can't find the user. So in this case, we deleted the user and our cookies think we're still attached to that user and logged in, but our Rails app now is smart enough to say, you had a user account before, but it doesn't exist anymore, and so we're going to leave it alone. And you're not going to be logged in because we can't find that user. And that way, our application does not crash, which we never want to have happen in production, and it still treats it the same as a logged out user. So that is how we can sign in our users with session cookies.